Let's now look at the Cuban Revolution when the rebels come to power in early 1959. And as you can tell from the image, when the rebels entered Havana, this was a moment of national liberation. Hundreds of thousands of people flocked to the streets to welcome the rebels as the dictator Fulgencio Batista was overthrown. And just think about it, 1,500 guerrilla fighters had overthrown a professional army of 35,000 troops. And when the rebels come to power, they had a kind of a vague general plan of action. They didn't really have a very specific plan. Some of the things they wanted to do was pursue social justice. They particularly wanted to restore national sovereignty to the island and to decrease the influence of the United States over Cuban politics. They did call for the government to play a stronger role in economic development. They wanted to diversify the Cuban economy away from monocrop agriculture. Cuba, for decades, had been dependent on sugar exports to the United States. And they wanted to decrease that dependence and stop producing so much sugar. And so they wanted to industrialize the country, as other countries in Latin America were undergoing. They also called for agrarian reform. Land reform was one of the things that all these revolutions in Cold War Latin America called for. And so they called for the modernization of the economy and for the government to play a stronger role in developing the country's economy. And in April of 1959, Fidel Castro goes to the United States, and he visits places like Harvard and Harlem, and he even came to Houston. And he went to Washington as well, and President Eisenhower would not meet with Fidel Castro. Eisenhower was a little bit skeptical of Castro, thought he was a hothead that could not be controlled. And so Castro met with Richard Nixon, who was the vice president at the time, and Richard Nixon lectured him about the evils of communism. And Fidel Castro returns to Cuba, and this is when relations between the United States and Cuba start to become more tense. Number one, in the early months of 1959 was when they carried out Revolutionary War tribunals. So about 500 police officers and army officers from the old dictatorship were put on trial. And this was swift revolutionary justice. And about 350 of these old army officers and police officers were found guilty of war crimes. And about 350 were executed. And the American public was turned off by this because these were really quick trials. It wasn't like trial by a jury or anything. And so the American public starts to turn against Castro, and also the United States is quite hostile of Castro as well, partly because of his rhetoric. He was denouncing U.S. influence on the island and talking about Cuba liberating itself from the United States. And it becomes clear that the rebels, although the war had been fought to overthrow a dictatorship, they weren't so much concerned with democracy as much as consolidating power. And Cuban society undergoes the militarization during these years. So about 50 to 60,000 men were organized into militias, and they were there to stamp out opposition. And committees for the defense of the revolution were established they established and formed surveillance in neighborhoods so they could keep tabs on who was opposing the new government. And if you were opposing the new government, you were denounced and you might be jailed. And this tended to alienate the middle class. A lot of people in the middle class in Cuba had supported the rebels, but when they come to power and a lot of the reforms they start to carry out start to alienate the middle class. And some of the early reforms were things like the 1959 land reform law. So they carried out a land reform, and 100,000 peasants were given titles to lands. And this affected a lot of middle-class people who had small holdings, and they lost their small farms. And the state also took over a lot of those farms, so the state benefited from this. And the Cuban government starts to assert more control over its economy, and this affects American investors and property owners in Cuba. So industries that were nationalized in the early 1960s were things like banks, transportation, sugar mills, telecommunications. The government's taking over these industries and doing it in the name of the common good for Cubans, but at the same time this was alienating people in the middle class and of course the elites, many of them who had left Cuba by now. And this was particularly upsetting the United States, who was having its business interests affected in these nationalizations. Cuba tries to industrialize in the early 1960s. It wanted to get away from depending on sugar exports and to become an industrialized country. And they try in the early 1960s, but it was really a failure. They were never able to promote industry to the point where it would thrive and flourish, and still remained quite dependent on sugar exports. All the while, about 250,000 Cubans they migrate from the island, and most of them go to Miami, where they are going to start organizing groups that will oppose Fidel Castro and the Cuban Revolution. And they're going to organize counter-revolutionary forces. And now we're going to talk about the Bay of Pigs. The Cubans who left the island and migrated to Miami, they hated Fidel Castro, and they hated the way that the government was becoming more socialistic with all these reforms. And of course, their properties had been affected by this. And so the American government and the CIA helped to organize these exiles in Miami. And the plan was to invade Cuba with this expeditionary force that would lead to an uprising. And the CIA had estimated that 75% of the population hated Fidel, but that was wrong. Fidel was much more popular at this time in the early 1960s than the CIA had estimated. And the plan was to replicate exactly what had occurred in Guatemala in 1954, when the CIA overthrew the Jacobo Arbenz government. And the idea was that 1,200 of these exiles would invade at the Bay of Pigs, which is in south central Cuba, and they would storm the beaches, and that this would lead to a general uprising that would overthrow Castro. Well, and by the way, John F. Kennedy had inherited this plan from Dwight Eisenhower. John F. Kennedy becomes president in January of 1961, and he goes along with this plan. And in mid-April of 61 is when the 1,200 exiles, they land at the Bay of Pigs, called Playa Girón in Spanish, and there were the revolutionary militias to meet the exiles. And it was a humiliating defeat for the exiles and a great victory for the Cuban revolutionary government. Because you can see here on the photo, there was a brief battle, but these exiles were met with overwhelming force from the revolutionary militias, and 1,200 of them were captured and taken prisoner. And this was a huge moment in Latin America, because it was like David taking on Goliath. The small little Cuba had taken on the United States, had confronted the United States, and was victorious at the Bay of Pigs. And so this was kind of another round of euphoria throughout Cuba. And this was also, very inspirational to a lot of Latin Americans who resented U.S. imperialism throughout the region. The Bay of Pigs had the effect of further polarizing diplomatic relations between Cuba and the United States. And as these conflicts increase, the United States strengthens its economic embargo on Cuba. The idea was to make it hard for Cuba to sell its exports in the United States. And so year after year, after Fidel Castro comes to power, the economic embargo is strengthened. And the idea was to economically strangle Cuba and make life hard on the island and hurt its economy, because that would either lead to Fidel Castro being overthrown by his own people, or he would moderate his policies and become more friendly with the United States. But as the economic embargo increases, this is when the Soviet Union steps in to become an ally and a partner of Cuba. And by 1962, the Soviets were openly trading with the island and providing arms and technology to the Castro government. And this relationship with the Soviets came at no cost to the Cubans. The Soviets are doing this because they have their own interest in its confrontation with the with the United States during the Cold War. And everyone, after the Bay of Pigs, everyone believed that the United States would invade again. It was only a matter of time before they would come after Castro once again. And it was Nikita Khrushchev, who was the leader of the Soviet Union during these years. He came up with the idea to install nuclear missiles in Cuba as a way to defend Castro and the Cuban Revolution. And Castro goes along with this because he sees this as a way to advance global socialism. And as the Soviet Union becomes closer with Castro, this is when Castro starts to become more of a socialist, and eventually he's going to adopt communism in his partnership with the Soviet Union. And missiles are installed on the island, nuclear missiles. And all the meanwhile, the United States, of course, is gathering intelligence about this, and this is what you see on the photo here. These were American planes that were flying over the island and taking pictures of the missile installations and where they were, and identifying exactly where they were located. And of course, there's no way that the Kennedy administration can go along with this. You can't have nuclear missiles in the middle of the Cold War, just 90 miles away from South Florida. And so Kennedy, his plan was to confront the Soviet Union and to do something about this. They were debating about what exactly to do, and the hawks inside of the Oval Office, where they're debating this, the generals, they were calling for war with Cuba and the Soviet Union, and that they should obliterate Cuba and bomb the country to smithereens. But the doves, on the other hand, were arguing instead for a naval blockade against further Soviet support of the island. And so the U.S. Navy goes into the Caribbean Sea, where it is going to block any further assistance from the Soviet, whether it's military or economic assistance to the island. And this is what leads to the Cuban Missile Crisis. And it lasted about 13 days, this blockade. And it was a very tense moment in world history. It looked like the world was on the brink of nuclear war. And Kennedy, again, he had, I think, taken the right advice and made the right decision to implement this naval blockade rather than going straight to war. And so during these 13 days, there were very tense negotiations between Moscow and Washington. And in the end, the agreement they came to was that Kennedy agreed to not invade Cuba if the Soviets would pull out their missiles from Cuba. And that was what was publicly known at the time. Later we learned that there was part of a private agreement as well, that the United States would remove its nuclear missiles from Turkey, which was on the border of the Soviet Union. But that part was kept private at the time. It wasn't until later that historians learned about this. And indeed, that was what saved the Cuban Revolution. The missiles are retrieved from Cuba, and Kennedy promised not to invade the island again. Now, for the remainder of the 60s and the 70s and 80s, there were plenty of CIA operations to kill Fidel Castro. They still funded guerrilla movements in the mountains. There was wild assassination plots to poison Castro's food, and even to create a cigar that he liked to smoke that would explode in his face, but they were all failures. And the Cuban Revolution survives after the missile crisis. Cuba then becomes an even closer partner with the Soviet Union. And the image you see here, that's Nikita Khrushchev on the right, whose idea was to put missiles in Cuba, and Fidel Castro, of course, there on the left. And Cuba had hoped to become a sovereign, independent country and not to be dependent on any foreign powers. But over time, throughout the late 60s and then through the 70s, Cuba in fact becomes dependent on Soviet economic aid. The Soviet Union would actually subsidize the Cuban economy and help to prop it up and to support it. To the tune of billions of dollars in economic aid Cuba was receiving from the Soviet Union after the missile crisis and into the 1970s and into the 1980s as well. And although meanwhile the Castro government becomes even more authoritarian. And you're probably quite familiar with the fact that there's no freedom of the press in Cuba. There's violations of human rights. Individual liberties really suffered under the Castro government, and the Castro government became much more concerned with consolidating and holding on to power than it did with individual political liberties on the island. And After 1970, in fact, Cuba had tried to be independent and to forge its own economic model. But after 1970, Cuba adopts the Soviet model of communism. And it's going to be modeled on that throughout the 1970s and the 1980s. And that's one of the paradoxes of the Cuban Revolution, was that it had been fought in the name of national sovereignty and decreasing imperialism on the island. But whereas Cuba had been dependent on the United States before the revolution, now Cuba becomes dependent on the Soviet Union for its economic aid after the Castro government came to power. And another paradox of the Cuban Revolution is that it had been fought to overthrow a dictatorship, that of Fulgencio Batista. But as we all know, Fidel Castro would become one of the longest serving dictators in Latin American history, ruling the country until just recently when he died in the mid-2010s. In 1990, of course, the Soviet Union collapses, and that led to what was called the Special Period in Cuban history. In the early 1990s, Cuba had no more economic aid from the Soviet Union, and it was very hard times for Cuba. Its economy suffered greatly. There was no oil or gasoline in the country, so everybody had to get around with bicycles. And of course, the United States remained hostile to Castro throughout these years. And the United States hated Castro because he defied Washington. He defied American hegemony, and he turned the island towards communism, which had been the main goal of U.S. foreign policy in Latin America during the Cold War.